Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course on 20th century fiction. This is Shikriti Shannal.
And I'm Soham Chakraborty.
And we are TAs for this course.
Yes.
And today we are going to mention some key features of modernist fiction with respect to some of the texts that have been discussed by Abhishek sir. So to begin with, among the techniques of modernism or modernist writing, we can talk about the narrative technique, which I think has been discussed thoroughly in the previous lectures, and which is most important because it differentiates from the narrative techniques of, say, the earlier eras like Victorian,
period.
The 19th century, the Victorian period, where we had the classic realism and that kind of a narrative structure. And when we come to modernism, then we see there are certain changes and shifts from that classic realist frame, and those are the things that we are going to discuss about. So, starting the starting point of talking about, say, nervous narrator is we can take the character of Marlowe from Heart of Darkness, and he himself, he is a very nervous narrator, as we know. He's very unsure of what he's saying, and he's sure that nobody is getting exactly what he's saying. So whatever meaning he's making or producing, he is not sure how to translate it or transfer it to his audience. Would you like to add something?
Yes, as we see, like Marlowe has a certain white male privilege that he has while he's going. He has a worldview through which he makes sense. So when we see that he's going into the jungles of Africa, that white male privilege is slowly ebbing away. And so we have examples of delayed decoding.
Right.
So
yeah, where he sees a lot of where sequences are mentioned not as directly, you're not going directly into the action or whatever is happening, you're not directly reaching the meaning, but we are just reaching or playing with the signifiers. So he says he can see arrows flying and shots, so those kind of imageries and symbols come before we actually get the meaning of what exactly is happening in that piece.
Yes, so this is like objects flying off before he knows that we are being shot at.
Exactly.
So meaning making happens
much
later.
Delayed. It's a delayed performance. Delayed decoding. And similarly, we can talk about the technique of defamiliarization, which is, again, we see a lot of it in Heart of Darkness and also in the modernist poetries that have been discussed. So defamiliarization is a technique where common, known and everyday objects are represented in a way that their meanings change or their significance changes. So even in this, in the novels, we see that when we talk about Congo and when we talk about the land of the natives and the natives themselves, we see how Marlowe, again coming back to the idea of the nervous narrator and the neurotic narrator, he doesn't know how to explain them anymore because he is again in a very unfamiliar setting, a setting that he himself does not understand. So his tools for meaning making, if I may put it that way, are, as you said, white and white male upper class. And then when he is taken away from that setting and put into Africa, when he's traveling through Congo, which is both a geographical and a psychological journey, then so his tools are not with him anymore. They don't make sense anymore, and he has a great difficulty in grasping whatever is going on around him and defining them. So there is a certain degree of defamiliarization there.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the privilege of Marlowe, that he's a white male colonizer, and we also see like how the white male colonizer's project is slowly getting subverted.
Right.
And we also see such a figure in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Peter Walsh, who's come back to England after he has been to India, but we see there is a certain amount of emptiness that's inside him, as if the whole grand project of colonization has left him empty. He's loveless, he has not been able to find love in his life. Yes, so and also we see that Virginia Woolf mentioning that how the First World War, the ending of the First World War, it does pose a crisis of colonization, colonialism. And we see how by the end of Second World War, the whole project of colonialism, the Britain's colonies falling apart, they have to be decolonized. So I think in that sense, it's a very interesting...
Right. And we can also talk about Conrad's ambivalence towards... colonialism itself, which is important because he's the one who's writing it, and so a lot of people see Heart of Darkness as post-colonial text, and a lot of people have an objection to that view because the common arguments are that the stereotypical representations of the natives, the fact that the natives don't have dialogue or they don't have as if the right to speak, and the perspective that is offered are again racial and gendered in certain ways, and so that is the perspective that we get of colonization again, but from the white perspective and not from the perspective of the black people. So the people concerned, the natives themselves. So these are the critiques in ways of seeing it as a post-colonial text. But as Sir has also mentioned that instead of taking this black and white binary, we can look into it's more interesting to look into the ambivalence of it. So whereas Conrad is not critiquing colonialism or completely invalidating its requirement or its existence, but we see that he brings out the reality, the stark, naked truth of what colonial enterprise means and what is the experience of it, both for the natives as well as for the colonizers. And so we see this more of the psychological effect of colonialism and the material and the discursive effects of the colonial enterprise in both the parties involved in that case. So this ambivalent attitude is something which brings around a very strong critique of colonialism, but in an indirect way, where he is not directly saying that colonialism is bad and we should put an end to it, but he's showing it as the truth, as the material reality of the times, but he's also highlighting the oppressive structures that are inherent in this
novel. Yes, and we are also reminded of the figure of Cornel Kurtz, who's traumatized. We see that, and looking at him is also a traumatizing experience for Marlowe, which also brings us that the trauma that the First World War created in the soldiers, and it was a destruction of an unprecedented range. So when soldiers came back, they were diagnosed with something that was called shell shock or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Talking about PTSD, as you mentioned, so after the Second World War and when a lot of soldiers were returning home, and they were definitely affected by what happened during the war, and they were unable to again speak about it or narrate those incidents exactly as it happened, much like our narrator Marlowe in Heart of Darkness. So they also were nervous narrators and totally unable to narrate, because nobody back home wanted to know those kind of realities. What exactly happened was there was no way they could convey those experiences, and they became sort of repressed experiences of violence that they were carrying back home with them, and so they were definitely affected psychologically and with also physical manifestations of PTSD. So we see Sigmund Freud very interestingly comes into popularity during that time in Vienna, and also his studies being accepted more and more during that time in America, where he conceived what we know as the talk therapy, and where which is obviously a part of the psychoanalytic strategy or the treatment project, and that was the time that it came into the mainstream, that people need help psychologically, and so and they were victim of a very specific event, like say the Second World War, and that initiated that kind of a need for therapy among the soldiers, and that kind of help that they received. And this is what precisely later on, because PTSD has meant different things in different times. When you if you see the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health. So the definitions of PTSD, like most of the illnesses, say depression, keeps on evolving and changing. So even now, currently, as much as I know, PTSD is, again, can refer to any traumatic event like childhood abuse or any experience, any experience of violence and oppression that has marked you during a particular point of time, and there are certain trigger points in presence or in the present or times or in the future times that can bring back those violent, vivid memories that have been repressed. So and that is an illness which is again treated with both therapy and medication.
And as you very interesting mentioned that Freud brought this talking cure, and that was there. And we see that Walter Benjamin in his essay The Storyteller says how men, when they returned from war, they were much less talkative. They could not speak. Rather than telling stories of the war, they couldn't even speak. And we see something like that happening with Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway, that he cannot speak, or he cannot speak in the way the society wants him to speak. We see that his wife, Razia Smith, constantly exhorting him to speak, to talk, but he can't talk. And even when he talks in reveries, he talks in fits and starts. But that becomes a traumatic source of trauma even for Razia Smith. That why is my husband talking in his sleep? Why is he suddenly starting in the crowd? And there is this always this thing that this needs to be hidden. There's this stigma around mental illness and also like a weak man that needs to be hidden, that a man cannot show signs of such mental illness. That
crisis of masculinity
that comes up. So we have that in there, and instead of we see that there are doctors in the novel Mrs. Dalloway, Bradshaw, Dr. Holmes, and they don't actually apply this kind of talking cure that Freud probably suggested. What they do is they ask for a rest cure, where you must rest for a long time and you must eat. So, and we have seen another fiction, Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking about it when you said rescue. And rescue is a very 19th century, a very Victorian sort of approach to mental illness, especially administered to women, because they felt that too much physical activity or exertion is bad for women who have hysterical or neurotic tendencies. So they were given a dose of regular rest, a healthy diet, and outrageous propositions like you cannot write, you cannot read, you just completely lie in the bed like an invalid, which is definitely seen as a form of oppression, like psychiatric oppression, by many writers like Perkins Gilman, and also many mental health activists who later on spoke against these kind of approaches.
Kind of rest cure, right. And so this inability to tell stories, inability to come with the society is exhorting him to come out of himself as if he's trapped inside, but the ways that he wants to come out are not acceptable either. So we see this certain blockage appearing, and we see this theme of blockage, of not being able to move, also in the wasteland, where we have deadly growth, where growth and regeneration are not organic forms but a form of deadness. So it's deadness growing from deadness. There is this blockage, like we have the block nose of Madame Sosostris in one of the sections. So it signifies a certain blockage in society where the flows have stopped and they're not flowing. And also another interesting thing, if you remember, that the mechanization of human motor processes, things that are the mechanization. So the human processes are slowly becoming mechanical.
And the machines are becoming more and more
human, and humans are becoming more and more mechanized.
And that again brings us to the fragmentation, which is again very important as a narrative technique, we might say, in the modernist age, because as we are talking about, so there is no possibility for a holistic understanding or representation of things anymore, because life as we see it itself is fragmented, and we don't have the rhetoric tools to bring them out like a coherent narrative is not possible. So even when we see, taking another of Eliot's poems, Love Song of Prufrock, J. Alfred Prufrock, and also in Preludes we see people being represented as, say, a set of hands or multiple feet, just walking down, trampling newspapers and drinking coffee. So we don't have, again, like a full image of a human body or a human narration. Even the scripts are fragmented. So even when you are having a dialogue, you cannot finish the line, or you cannot you stop, you pause, and so again, so there is this stream of consciousness technique which is there. So all these features and these multiple techniques that we are talking about, they bring out the crisis of the modern times, which is again due to excessive commodification and due to the technocracy and machinization of life. So human life has become fragmented and detached and very melancholic because everybody is alienated and everybody is fragmented in their own personal as well as extended lives.
Yes.
So, and that, I think these techniques beautifully exhibit that kind of a tendency.
Yes, and as I mentioned, there is this blockage, there is this fragmentation, and this narrative of stream of consciousness. We see like it signifies a certain flow which is otherwise missing in society. So probably we see this kind of narrative that speak whatever comes to your head. Because we see people are getting lost inside their heads. They don't know what to say, what not to say. So maybe the answer is to say whatever comes to your head, because we need to start moving back again. And this stream idea we also find at the end of The Wasteland, where Eliot almost exerts Ganga to come down and flow through Europe again to revitalize it. So the idea of streams, the flowing, that the rivers can come and rejuvenate us, I think that where we must speak out, where whatever comes we must speak out, we must not hold back. That becomes a very important.
Very important. And then and even I think in Ulysses, so there are certain passages without punctuations which run on lines, which so the lack of punctuation again is very relevant, that we cannot follow the conventional way of saying things, and so our pauses and our gaps cannot be measured in the conventional rhetoric possibilities, and we have to invent new ways of expressing. So when we are expressing an emotion and a very strong emotion, and often we are not able to narrate it in a conventional structure, within a conventional structure. So, and the lines, the emotions run on to each other, because you cannot identify one emotion separately from another emotion.
True.
So our common pauses like periods or a comma or a semicolon, they also carry a lot of meaning. So where you're pausing, why you're pausing, that also is relevant to the meaning making process.
Course.
And doing away with the punctuations altogether also shows, how, as I said, the different emotions like run onto each other, and there is this urgency that I need to speak this now, this in my mind, and so there is no leisurely time to sit and frame your ideas. So that is the kind of narrative they are trying to project.
Yes. And even if it's incoherent, to speak it out. Like you mentioned Joyce, and we have Joyce, Finnegans Wake.
Yes. Finnans Wake.
So you mentioned Joyce, and we have another novel by Joyce called Finnegans Wake, where we see jumbled words. It's a mixing of languages, but so it highlights the fact that whatever you might be speaking at the end of the modern era or anything, but the fact that you must keep speaking, you must not stop. And to come back to this thing, the lack of human agency, and we have seen in some selves that the human self is a storytelling self. I'm reminded of a paper by Professor Parui that he published, and there he mentions that what distinguishes the human self from some other selves is that we have a natural knack for storytelling. And so we see that with the lack of this storytelling, almost the human quality of people are kind of going down. They're becoming more object-like. And we see in the novel Mrs. Dalloway how Septimus Smith is constantly portrayed as a tree. A tree. And so he's like an object that cannot speak, that object that is mute. And Razia Smith, his wife, is trapped in that marriage like a small bird trapped in a tree. And we have other also references to objects like the Big Ben that slowly come to have a certain control over people's lives with their control of people's life, with announcement of time, that the fact that something can stand like a phallic device standing there and announcing time to everyone that they must obey. And it's also mentioned in the story as a young boy who's just flicking around dumbbells. So as we see that there's a certain order, certain thing about announcing that time, at the same time there's this arbitrariness, there's this whim of oppressing people with that time that is also kind of seen. And we see that is also very nicely countered with a very small clock that is in Mrs. Dalloway's room, which announces time always 2 minutes later than the Big Ben. So that becomes very interesting. So while in the public sphere it becoming like our lives are under control, Big Ben, but we see that there is slowly still some possibilities of reclaiming life within the private sphere, where the clock still gives you time which is 2 minutes less. It still gives you some leeway, some relaxation from this urgency of life.
This is what Sir has also mentioned as the difference between the real time and the personal, the clock time and the personal. No. And this discussion about time and the distorted time as well as the clock time, which brings us, which constantly can be seen as an oppressive force, which ties us to our mundaneness of the daily lives. So we can differentiate between the two times, which is the psychological time as well as the clock time. So the clock time is the worldly time, the universal time that everybody has to adhere to. And whereas the psychological time is a more personal understanding of time, because and how our minds conceive events and react to them, and it does not always, most of the times I think it does not stick to the universal time, so it has a time of its own, our minds and our bodies. So, and whenever there is a disjunction between those two times, those two paradigms, I think there is a distortion, there is a again there's a split, there's a gap, a fissure, sort of, so that is what again further complicates things. And many of these texts that we have in our syllabus and the poems, the fictions, we see that this has been brought out by most of the writers and the authors, that this split between the time, the individual time as well as the universal time.
Universal time. Yes, and it's very interesting. So we see that this, with this essence of time passing on and everything, and we see that there is this element of epiphany that kind of comes almost towards the end. Right. In the end, like it's a journey that you undertake across time, and when you reach towards the end, there is this epiphanic moment that you encounter. And it's not always a nice thing. Epiphanies are not always nice things. So we see in Araby, the boy is looking for a more profound truth, a more profound truth in life, in love, but what he's finally greeted with is not even a profound lie, but a flippant lie, that the world is just the way it is. And we also see in novels like Heart of Darkness, the epiphany is one of annihilation, that it kind of destroys the self, that you kind of understand that your Eurocentric civilization, your Eurocentric view of life, that can always be threatened, that a person like Kurtz, who's been the paragon of European civilization, he can come and there are certain elements that can almost get him to a prehistoric time, nullifying any idea of civilization that has been inscribed on him.
The image of Buddha, I think, is very important, even in Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is is compared to a Buddha. But then, where we see that the enlightenment that he receives is not one that of light, but it's one that of darkness. It's almost a reversal of enlightenment. And similarly, like a Buddha, he could not become a prophet. He does not have the instrument to narrate his enlightenment or experience to the extended world, because again, because his experience is that of darkness, and it's that of disorientation, in that and then he does not, something that cannot be expressed in the conventional structures of language that are available to us. So this we also see in Love Song, where we talk about figures like Hamlet and Lazarus, and so these are all positive images, but then what we end up being are the fools, say Shakespearean fool, who has a lot to say, who's always speaking the truth, but nobody is taking them seriously. So there is no possibility to become a prophet and to articulate a greater understanding of things. But even if you are able to, or if you're attempting to articulate it, all that you can articulate is darkness and negative thoughts and in broken language, language that is again fragmented and defamiliarized,
not coherent.
And
yes, and we see, like we were talking about this language, about this flow, Heart of Darkness, Marlowe sailing into the Heart of Darkness. So we see this connection forming between rivers and narrative and storytelling, and it's very interesting. And but we see that even this flow in Heart of Darkness, not that it necessarily leads the white man to something good. It's as you said, it's not an epiphany of darkness. It's not an epiphany of light, but an epiphany of darkness. So as we said, like if even if we see this kind of flowing as a sort of remedy, but it still becomes something like it might lead you to some dark places. And so we saw how colonialism started as this project to the seas, where people started flowing out and everything. And not only do we see in modernity that there's this critique that people are not being able to flow so easily, but the fact that they're coming to a standstill, that there are probably no more places left in the world to conquer,
yes.
and now it's time to let go of them. It's time to lose sovereignty over them. But even this project of flowing is also questioned. That where are we flowing to? Where are we going towards? And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. And then we see, when you talk about this language and Marlowe's experience, we see towards the end of the novel Heart of Darkness how he is unable to say the truth to Kurtz's fiance or the woman he was supposed to marry. And then when they have this conversation and she wants to know what were his last words were, and so Marlowe says that he said your name, and but then that is just exactly the opposite of what he said, and he said the horror, and so. And there is a complete reversal of this truth of what Marlowe knows, because he does not have, again, the proper setting or the proper audience, because even that the white woman waiting or mourning for Kurtz, she doesn't want to know what happened really, and Marlowe definitely cannot tell her what the reality is, and she's not the proper audience for it, and nobody back home can again know. So even if you're willing to narrate your experiences, or you do not have the proper setting, you do not have the proper audience who would understand or make meaning of what you're saying without distorting it or making it, farcical in a particular sense. So they lose their meanings. The incidents of, say, a colonial enterprise lose their meaning as soon as they go away from the setting, as soon as they go away from the Congo setting and return back to the Brussels, the white city of Brussels, and so everything, the meanings themselves change and acquire different dimensions. And this is again another which shows the the inability to narrate your personal experience, or inability to use language successfully and coherently.
Yes, I think that's very interesting, and we can slowly wrap up now.
Right.
And would you like to say something about the female characters that we have seen in these novels?
Yes. The female characters, mostly, if you again talk about Conrad's novels, so we see there are two female characters. The one is Kurtz's fiance waiting back in Brussels for him to return, and the other one is the woman he's having an affair with, or mistress, as we might say, and she is the black woman. And both the representations are very stereotypical, and in the sense that the black woman is shown as exotic, very sensuous. She's almost reduced to her body, and she's no longer a human being anymore. Whereas the woman back in Brussels, she is the epitome of purity, and she's obviously white, which again equates to purity, and she is civilized, most importantly, and she is represented more of asexual terms, and which is again contradicting to that image with of the black woman. She is completely sexualized, and here we see her as asexual. So this is again this dichotomy shows us how we understand both native women and white women, and how there is always like this angel in the house, and the this is what we see in the Madonna Magdalene dichotomy that we have. So you can either be good or evil, black or white, sexual or sexual. So in terms of these binaries, but that they do not represent a complete, does not do justice. Conrad, I believe, doesn't do justice to either of the women in the novel. And funnily enough, they don't have a single line or a single speech or any dialogue or script.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the black woman is all body, all embodiment, and the white woman is very not asexual kind of. So we also see that the fact that Kurtz's fiance must be lied to provides that she has a psychological life which can be wounded. And also we see Razia Smith, there is also her inner life, a psychological life where we see her thinking, which is like an area that must be protected, a sphere of memories, a sphere of love for others, and that's I think very interesting.
It also shows the vulnerability that mostly women can't handle hard truth, and they have to live in that oblivion or that bubble that men creates for them.
Yes.
We'll wrap up today's discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.